were you forced to go Karen mode on your child's teacher? When did you realize your child's teacher was deliberately destroying their identity? My 7-year-old nonverbal autistic son Haran started hitting himself every morning before school, screaming when I said his name. It had taken 4 years of therapy for him to finally recognize and type his name on his communication device. When I checked the device's history, I saw that someone had reprogrammed it. Every instance of Haran had been replaced with Harry. I confronted Mrs. Jackson at pickup, and she proudly said, "I changed it. Some kids in this class have speech impediments. Haran is too difficult for them to pronounce. Harry is easier." I stood there in shock. She'd erased my son's name without asking or telling me. "Change it back," I said. She smiled that kindergarten teacher smile. "I've been teaching special needs for 30 years. I know what's best for their integration. This is America. Harry fits better." I knew I couldn't do anything just yet, so I just started paying attention. I saw how Xiaoli's mom was being told Lily had a great day. Yichin was Ian on the progress board. Mei Ling's cubby said Mary. Every Asian child had been renamed. The Pakistani boy Mohammed was Mo. The Nigerian girl Adaisy was Ada. But somehow she managed Mackenzie, Braxton, Lorgfen. Those names weren't too difficult for the other kids to pronounce. I called other parents that night. Mrs. Jackson had been doing this for years. She told one Chinese mom that American names would help with future employment. She told a Korean dad his daughter's name was a burden she didn't need. She'd literally crossed out their real names in red pen on worksheets, writing the American names above. One mom said her daughter now refused to answer to her birth name at home. Another said her son had stopped speaking entirely after being punished for not responding to Jason instead of Jia Hao. These were disabled children who took years to learn their names, and she was erasing them. When 8 of us complained together, the principal backed her completely. Mrs. Jackson has 3 decades of experience. She knows what helps these children succeed. The special ed coordinator, who happened to be Mrs. Jackson's brother-in-law, said it wasn't a policy issue. The superintendent suggested we were making a mountain out of a molehill. I requested my son's records and found she'd been documenting his failure to respond to his name as cognitive decline, recommending more restrictive placement. She was literally creating evidence of damage by changing his name, then using his confusion to prove he needed worse services. Haran had taken 3 years to learn his name. 3 years of daily practice, meltdowns, breakthroughs. Now he didn't respond to it at all. The district offered to move him to another class in 18 months when a spot opened. 18 months. Or I could drive 90 minutes each way to another district, or homeschool and lose my job, or pay $60,000 for private special needs school. She was the only special ed teacher for high support autism in the district. Every option destroyed our lives while she kept erasing children. When I threatened to go to the media, the principal pulled out my IEP agreement and showed me the arbitration clause. "Any disputes must be handled internally," he said. "Going public violates your contract. We'd have to remove Haran from services." The breaking point came at the multicultural festival. Mrs. Jackson stood at the special needs booth, cheerfully introducing Harry to visitors. My son, wearing a name tag I hadn't seen before that said Harry in huge letters, was having a meltdown. She kept saying, "Harry needs to calm down," while he hit himself. That's when her mask slipped. A new parent asked about the name tag, noting my son looked Asian. Mrs. Jackson laughed. "Oh, his real name is impossible. These parents don't think about their children's futures when they give them these names. We're doing them a favor." The parent looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Jackson continued, "I mean, can you imagine trying to get a job with a name no one can pronounce? I've been fixing this problem for 15 years. That's when I decided I was done. I filed a FOIA request for all emails about my son. It took a lot of bureaucratic back and forth, but I got access to all her emails that mentioned my son. That's when I saw it. 3 years of Harry in official communications. But even worse than that, and the reason I did what I did next, was she'd been marking Asian children as language deficient to get extra funding, documenting their failure to integrate when she was the one refusing to integrate them. A few days later, I brought Haran's entire speech therapy team to an emergency IEP meeting. The lead therapist explained that changing his name had destroyed 2 years of progress. She read Mrs. H. Jackson's own emails aloud. "Child does not recognize his own name. Recommend cognitive reassessment." The therapist's voice shook with anger. "He doesn't recognize it because you changed it. This is educational neglect." Mrs. Jackson tried to argue that simplified names helped special needs children. The speech therapist cut her off. "I'm filing a mandatory reporter complaint for abuse, right now, in front of everyone." She pulled out her phone and called CPS from the conference room. The principal went white. The superintendent started stammering about miscommunication. I forwarded everything to the Office of Civil Rights, the ACLU, and the State Licensing Board before I left the building. They all said the same thing. Investigations take months, sometimes years. Meanwhile, Haran still had to go to her class every morning. My phone started buzzing at 4 in the morning, and I grabbed it before it could wake my husband. The Chinese mom was texting me that Xiaoli had spent 3 hours last night hitting her head against the wall and screaming her real name over and over. Her older sister had recorded it on her phone because nobody at the district believed them about the meltdowns happening at home. I texted back that we needed to document everything, and she sent me 17 videos from the past week alone. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I opened my laptop and started building a spreadsheet to track every single time Haran hurt himself since the name change began. I went through my phone photos first, screenshots of bruises on his arms, videos of him scratching until he bled. Then I checked the communication log from his device where it recorded every time he'd typed distress signals like hurt or scared or wrong name. The pattern jumped out immediately because every single incident happened within minutes of someone calling him Harry. I had 3 months of data showing he'd gone from 0 self-harm incidents to averaging 4 per day. By 6:30, I was getting Haran ready for school, and he kept pulling away from his clothes, typing no, no, no on his device. I had to physically hold his arms to get his shirt on while he kicked at me. The Chinese mom texted that she was keeping Xiaoli home today because the girl had bruises all over her forehead from hitting it. I wanted to keep Haran home too, but the district had already threatened truancy charges against another parent who'd done that. At drop-off, I walked straight to Mrs. Jackson with a letter from Jane that I'd had printed on legal letterhead demanding she use only Haran's legal name effective immediately. She took it with that same kindergarten teacher smile and said she'd consider it after reviewing it with administration. I watched her fold it in half and stick it in her pocket like it was a grocery list. 20 minutes later, I was back at work when my phone buzzed with an email from Jamie at the district. The subject line said, "Concerns regarding hostile communication," and the message warned that any further aggressive or threatening communication with staff members could result in my immediate removal from campus and restriction of access to the school grounds. They were calling a legal demand letter aggressive. They were literally trying to ban me from my own son's school for asking them to use his actual name. I forwarded it straight to Jane, who called me within 5 minutes telling me to save everything and not respond. The speech therapist called me on my lunch break from her personal cell phone, whispering that she wasn't supposed to be contacting me directly. She'd documented everything for the CPS investigation and had 17 other staff members who'd witnessed Mrs. Jackson's behavior but were scared to speak up. The brother-in-law connection meant anyone who complained got transferred to worse schools or had their hours cut. She said 3 teachers had already been moved after questioning the name changes. She gave me their names and numbers before hanging up quickly. That evening, 8 of us parents met at the Korean dad's house to practice our board meeting speeches. We had exactly 3 minutes each according to the rules, so we timed each other with a kitchen timer. The Pakistani mom kept crying during hers, so we helped her rewrite it to focus on facts instead of emotions. The Korean dad had charts showing the increase in behavioral incidents since the name changes started. I practiced saying Haran's name clearly and slowly, explaining what it meant in Mandarin, how it connected him to his grandfather who died before he was born. We helped each other cut unnecessary words and repeated our main demand over and over: use our children's legal names. The next morning, Haran saw his backpack and started hitting himself immediately, typing "no Harry place" over and over on his device. I tried everything to calm him down, but he kept scratching at his arms until they bled. I had to physically carry him to the car while he thrashed and screamed. My husband took a video of it because we needed evidence of what this was doing to him. I wonder what's really going through Mrs. Jackson's mind when she smiles that teacher smile while completely dismissing these parents' concerns. There's something unsettling about how she's been doing this for 15 years and nobody stopped her until now. That brother-in-law connection seems awfully convenient for keeping complaints quiet. At the school, I saw a new laminated notice taped to the door saying all parents had to sign in at the office and couldn't enter classrooms without scheduled appointments made at least 24 hours in advance. The security guard who'd always waved me through now stopped me and pointed to the sign. Other parents were standing around looking confused. The Nigerian mom asked how she was supposed to pick up her daughter's medicine if she couldn't enter the classroom. The guard just kept pointing at the sign. During my lunch break, I drove to the district office to file a formal complaint about the new access restrictions. The secretary took my paper and dropped it into a filing cabinet that looked completely full, telling me the review process was quite backed up and it could be 6 to 8 weeks before someone looked at it. I asked for a receipt showing I'd filed it and she said they didn't do receipts. I took a photo of her holding my complaint before I left. That afternoon, Maya texted asking if I had copies of the emails showing Mrs. Jackson had coached other teachers to use the American names. I sat in my car and forwarded her everything. The whole chain showing how she'd sent templates to other teachers, explaining how to document the children's failure to respond to create evidence for more restrictive placements. I knew I was violating the arbitration clause, but Haran had fresh scratches on his arms, and Xiaoli was home with a concussion from hitting her head, and the district was protecting Mrs. Jackson while our kids destroyed themselves. 3 days passed before the CPS investigator showed up at the school, and I watched from my car in the parking lot as Mrs. Jackson walked them around the playground. She was all smiles and big hand gestures while pointing at the special needs area, and I could see her nodding and laughing like they were having the best conversation ever. The investigator kept writing things down on their clipboard, and Mrs. Jackson kept touching their arm in that friendly way she did with parents she was trying to win over. They went inside after 20 minutes, and I sat there for another hour until they came back out and shook hands by the front entrance. Later that afternoon, I found out from another parent who worked in the office that Mrs. Jackson had told the investigator the name changes were therapeutic interventions designed to help the children integrate better with their peers. She'd actually used medical language to make it sound like she was helping our kids instead of erasing them. That night after Haran went to bed, I logged into the parent portal to check his daily reports and discovered Mrs. Jackson had started a whole new documentation pattern that made my stomach drop. She was writing things like Harry refuses to respond to redirection, and Harry demonstrates oppositional behavior when given simple instructions. But the truth was that Haran didn't recognize Harry as his name, so of course he wasn't responding. She was literally creating evidence that he was getting worse by using a name he didn't know, and then documenting his confusion as defiance. The reports from the last week showed a clear pattern where she'd mark him as non-compliant multiple times a day and recommend he might need a more restrictive placement with higher behavioral support. I screenshot everything and sent it to our parent group chat where everyone started checking their own kids' reports and finding the same thing happening. The next morning, I called 3 different special education advocates whose numbers I'd gotten from an autism support group, and every single one confirmed this was her pattern. They'd seen it before with other teachers, but Mrs. Jackson was especially good at it because she had 30 years of documentation to back up her methods. The first advocate told me she renames the child, then documents their confusion as cognitive decline, and uses that to recommend restrictive placement to get them out of her class. The second one said she'd seen Mrs. Jackson do this to at least 15 kids over the years, and the district always backed her because her paperwork was perfect. The third advocate actually laughed bitterly and said Mrs. Jackson was known in advocate circles as the teacher who could make any child look like they needed institutionalization through documentation alone. That same afternoon, the Korean dad forwarded me an email where Mrs. Jackson had told him his son needs behavioral intervention for not answering to Ian instead of Yichin. She'd written a 3-page report about how Yichin was showing signs of selective mutism and oppositional defiant disorder because he wouldn't respond to Ian even though the kid had been responding to his actual name just fine before she changed it. The email recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation and possible medication to address his deteriorating condition, which was really just a 7-year-old autistic boy who didn't know he was supposed to answer to a completely different name. The dad was devastated because the psychiatric referral would go in his son's permanent record and follow him forever. On day 4 of this mess, I met with Jane Marshall at a coffee shop near the school, and she pulled out a binder full of forms and templates. She explained that we needed to document everything in real time because the district would claim we were exaggerating if we relied on memory later. She gave me a template for daily incident logs that included spaces for exact times and quotes and witness names and told me to fill one out every single day, even if nothing major happened. She said the key was creating a paper trail that was more detailed than Mrs. Jackson's, so when it went to court, court, we'd have evidence that contradicted her version. She also told me to request all of Horan's educational records going back 3 years and to look for patterns in how Mrs. Jackson documented him versus how other teachers and therapists did. During pickup that afternoon, I saw Mrs. Jackson had put new name tags on all the immigrant children's cubbies, and the American names were in huge, colorful letters, while their real names were in tiny gray print underneath. The visual hierarchy was so obvious it made me sick because even the cubbies were teaching these kids that their real names were less important. I took photos with my phone while pretending to check texts and noticed other parents doing the same thing. The Chinese mom texted our group chat an hour later that she'd tried to change her daughter's cubby label back to just Xiaoli during pickup, but when she came back the next morning, it had been changed back to Lily with Xiaoli in tiny letters again. Someone was monitoring and enforcing this, and it wasn't just Mrs. Jackson, because she'd been in a meeting when the label got changed back. The maintenance staff was involved, or maybe the principal had told them to keep changing things back, but either way, it was systematic. The next day, I learned from a sympathetic aide who pulled me aside in the parking lot that Mrs. Jackson had held a staff meeting about consistency in name usage. The aide was shaking while she told me that Mrs. Jackson had explicitly told all the aides and support staff to only use the American names because using multiple names would confuse the special needs children. She said anyone who used the birth names would be written up for insubordination and potentially fired. The aide was scared but said she'd testify if subpoenaed because she couldn't stand watching these kids suffer anymore. That afternoon, Jamie Fisher sent another letter to all the parents involved, stating that our coordinated harassment campaign was disrupting the educational environment and causing emotional distress to Mrs. Jackson and the staff. They were painting us as the aggressors while our children were having meltdowns and self-harming from the daily identity erasure. The letter threatened legal action if we continued our hostile communication and reminded us again about the arbitration clause. At the Emergency Parent Coalition meeting that night in someone's living room, we decided we had to start recording drop-offs and pickups on our phones for evidence. We knew it might escalate tensions, but we needed proof of what was happening because the district kept denying everything, and Mrs. Jackson's documentation made our kids look like they were falling apart when really she was the one destroying them. The next morning, I had my phone ready in my pocket when I walked Haran into the classroom. Mrs. Jackson's smile froze when she saw me hit record on my phone as she took his hand. She let go of him immediately and walked straight to the classroom phone on the wall. I kept recording while she punched numbers and spoke quietly into the receiver. 2 security guards showed up within 3 minutes. The bigger one pointed at my phone and said I was violating student privacy laws by recording in a classroom. I tried explaining I was only recording my own son, but he grabbed my wrist and made me unlock my phone. Haran started rocking back and forth watching this stranger touch me. The guard deleted the video while Mrs. Jackson stood there with her arms crossed. Other parents were dropping off their kids and staring at us. The guard told me next time they'd ban me from campus entirely. My hands were shaking as I kissed Haran goodbye and left. I drove straight to the police station and waited 40 minutes to file a report about the forced deletion of evidence. The officer typed everything up and seemed sympathetic, but kept saying this sounded like a civil matter between me and the school district. He gave me a case number and said the report would be available in 5 business days. My phone rang as I was walking back to my car, and Maya Kwan's name popped up on the screen. She said her editor was getting nervous about running the story without harder evidence of the financial angle. Mrs. Jackson's got documentation skills that would make a lawyer jealous. Turning confused kids who don't know their new fake names into defiant students who need special placement is some next-level paper trail magic. She needed documents showing how Mrs. Jackson connected the name changes to getting extra funding for language services. I told her about the security incident, and she went quiet for a moment before saying that was good, but not enough. That afternoon, I drove to the district office and filled out a Freedom of Information Act request for all grant applications, where Mrs. Jackson had listed students as language deficient. The clerk behind the desk looked at my request and said processing would take 30 business days minimum. She stamped it and gave me a receipt with a tracking number. I was checking my email in the parking lot when my phone rang with an unknown number. The woman on the other end said her name was something I couldn't catch, and her son Mohammed had been in Mrs. Jackson's class last year. She'd heard about our parent group from another mom at the mosque. Her son had been renamed Mo, and she thought she was alone in fighting this until now. She had a folder full of documentation showing how Mohammed went from speaking in full sentences to going completely nonverbal after the name change. We met at a coffee shop that evening, and she spread out progress reports and therapy notes across the table. The regression was documented by 3 different specialists. She'd been told Mohammed was just going through a phase. 2 days later, the superintendent's office finally called back about our coalition's request for a meeting. His secretary said he could give us 30 minutes, but only 2 representatives were allowed in the room. We had to choose who would speak for 8 families worth of pain and frustration. The group voted for me and the Korean dad, whose daughter had been renamed from Sujin to Susan. We spent hours preparing our talking points and organizing our evidence binders. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. We showed up 10 minutes early and waited in uncomfortable chairs outside his office. He kept us waiting an extra 20 minutes before his secretary finally let us in. The superintendent sat behind his huge desk and didn't stand up when we entered. He kept looking at his computer screen while we explained our concerns about the systematic renaming of our children. When the Korean dad started talking about cultural identity, the superintendent cut him off. He said we needed to understand that American educational norms required flexibility from immigrant families. He used the word flexibility 4 times in 2 minutes. He called our concerns cultural misunderstandings and suggested we were making integration harder for our own children. The Korean dad's jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscle twitching. The superintendent said Mrs. Jackson was a decorated teacher with 30 years of experience who knew what was best for special needs students. He gave us pamphlets about cultural adjustment and said the meeting was over. We hadn't even opened our evidence binders. That evening, I got a call from the special ed coordinator who happened to be Mrs. Jackson's brother-in-law. He said he was concerned about my hostile attitude toward the staff and suggested maybe Haran would be better served in a different district. His voice was calm, but the threat was clear. He mentioned that the nearest appropriate placement was quite far away and transportation wasn't guaranteed. He said he hoped we could all work together for Haran's benefit and hung up before I could respond. I spent the rest of the night on my laptop researching other districts with special education programs. The closest one with high support autism services was 90 minutes away in good traffic. The website said they had a 2-year waiting list. Another district 45 minutes away had services buses but required parents to provide transportation. I calculated the gas money and time and realized I'd have to quit my job. Every option meant destroying our family's stability. 3 weeks later, the independent evaluator we'd been waiting months to see finally assessed Haran. She spent 2 hours with him using his communication device and observing his responses. She wrote in her report that the name confusion had caused significant regression in communication skills that could take years to rebuild. It was the first official validation we'd gotten from anyone with actual credentials. She said she'd testify if needed. The next morning, I walked Haran into school and saw Mrs. Jackson standing at her classroom door with a clipboard. She wrote something down the second she saw me, then smiled that fake smile while calling out, "Good morning, Harry," to my son. I watched her write more notes after I looked at her. She kept that clipboard with her all day. I found out later from another parent who volunteered that morning. Every time I picked up Haran or dropped him off, she'd make notes about my facial expressions and body language. The volunteer parent showed me a photo she'd snuck of the clipboard where Mrs. Jackson had written things like "mother displays aggressive posture" and "hostile eye contact maintained for extended period." She was building a case against me while still refusing to use my son's actual name. Jane called me that afternoon to say she'd filed the emergency injunction to get all school documents corrected immediately. The judge set the hearing for 6 weeks out. 6 more weeks of damage while we waited for basic human decency. I started driving Haran to private speech therapy 3 towns over because I couldn't trust anyone at the school anymore. The therapist there was shocked at how much he'd regressed in just a few weeks. She had to start over with name recognition exercises we'd done 2 years ago. My boss pulled me aside after I'd left early for the 3rd time that week. He said my attendance was becoming a problem, and I needed to figure out my personal situation or face consequences. I tried explaining, but he just said everyone has family issues. The district called Jane's office 2 days later with their big compromise solution. They'd use Harry Horan on all documents, hyphenated like that was somehow fixing the problem. Jane told them that wasn't acceptable since his name wasn't Harry, anything. It was just Horan. They acted like we were being unreasonable. The administrator on the phone actually said we should be grateful they were willing to include any part of his real name. Maya's article dropped online the next morning before the print edition came out. Within 3 hours, it had been shared over 10,000 times. The comments section exploded with parents sharing their own stories about teachers changing their kids' names. People were angry. Teachers were defending Mrs. Jackson, saying we didn't understand how hard their jobs were. Parents were sharing screenshots of worksheets where their children's names had been crossed out in red pen. By noon, 3 news stations had called me for interviews. Mrs. Jackson went on administrative leave that afternoon, but it was paid leave and she was still sending lesson plans to her substitute through the school email system. The principal sent out a message saying this was just temporary while they investigated, making it clear they expected her back soon. The substitute teacher, Giselle, actually tried to use the kids' real names, but she kept messing up because every label in the classroom still had the American names. The cubbies, the behavior chart, the reading groups, everything still said Harry and Lily and Mary. She spent the first hour trying to match faces to both sets of names using the class photo with post-it notes. Haran was confused when she called him by his actual name since he'd been trained for months to only respond to Harry in that room. My phone started buzzing with messages from parents I'd never met. A mom in Texas said her daughter's teacher had been calling her Amy instead of Amara for 2 years. A dad in Florida said his son's teacher changed Dimitri to Danny without even telling them. These stories came from everywhere. Public schools and private schools, red states and blue states. This was happening all over the country, but our district was the first where parents had organized to fight back publicly. A reporter from the Washington Post called and said they were doing a feature on the name erasure epidemic in American schools. She wanted to know if I'd noticed any patterns about which names got changed and which didn't. I told her about McKensley and Braxton and Lorgfen being perfectly fine while every non-white name was too difficult. She said she'd heard the same thing from dozens of other parents. By the end of week 4, the district's lawyer called Jane with a settlement offer. They'd correct all the names, provide 1 day of sensitivity training for staff, and give us a written apology if we signed NDAs and dropped all complaints. No admission of wrongdoing, no real consequences for Mrs. Jackson, no systemic changes, just sweep it under the rug and shut us up. Jane told them we'd need to see the terms in writing, but she was already advising against it. This wasn't just about our kids anymore. The CPS investigator finally submitted her report after 5 weeks. She found concerns regarding the educational environment, but no criminal charges would be filed. She recommended additional oversight of Mrs. Jackson's classroom, but didn't specify who would provide it or what that would look like. It was basically nothing. A strongly worded suggestion that everyone would ignore. The principal forwarded the report to all the parents like it vindicated Mrs. Jackson, highlighting the no criminal charges part while ignoring the concerns finding. That same night, Haran woke up screaming at 2 in the morning. He was hitting his head against the wall and yelling, "I am Haran," over and over again. I ran to his room and found him tangled in his sheets with sweat soaking through his pajamas. How does the superintendent manage to sit through that whole meeting without even looking at their evidence binders? The way he kept staring at his computer screen while they're talking about their children makes me wonder what could possibly be more important than listening to parents' concerns about their kids' identities being erased. He kept typing the same thing on his device even though it was turned off. His fingers moved across the blank screen spelling out his name again and again. This happened every night for the next week. The therapist said it was trauma response from having his identity attacked every single day at the school. She explained that kids with autism need consistency and routine more than anything else. Having his name changed was breaking his whole understanding of who he was. The nightmares got worse when the district sent out an email 3 weeks later. Mrs. Jackson would return from administrative leave next month unless the school board voted to remove her. They were actually thinking about putting her back in the same classroom with the same kids. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The email said the investigation found no policy violations that warranted termination. They called the name changes a teaching method that fell within her discretion as an educator. Our parent coalition wasn't going to let this happen without a fight. We organized a protest outside the district office for the next board meeting. Maya called every parent she knew and told them to bring signs in their own languages. The morning of the protest, hundreds of people showed up. There were signs in Chinese, Korean, Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, and languages I couldn't even identify. They all said versions of "My name is not too difficult for you" in different scripts. Parents brought their kids who held up signs with their real names written in huge letters. The local news showed up and and started interviewing families about what had happened. The school board members had to walk past all of us to get into the building. Most of them kept their heads down and rushed inside without making eye contact, but 3 of them stopped to talk to us privately after the meeting ended. They pulled us aside one by one and said they supported us but couldn't vote against Mrs. Jackson publicly. They mentioned union contracts and political pressure and how their hands were tied. One of them actually said she was afraid of backlash from other teachers if she voted to fire a 30-year veteran. Their cowardice made me so angry I could barely speak. These were the people supposed to protect our kids, and they were more worried about politics. While they were playing games, more documents started arriving from my FOIA request. Box after box of files showed up at my house over the next 2 weeks. I spent every night after Haran went to bed going through them with a highlighter. What I found made everything clear. For 15 years, Mrs. Jackson had been marking Asian and immigrant children as having language deficiencies at 3 times the rate of other students. Each diagnosis meant extra funding for the district. The pattern was obvious when you looked at the numbers. Kids with foreign names got flagged for language services even when English was their first language. The funding requests always mentioned the difficulty of cultural integration and the need for intensive intervention. She was literally using our kids' names to get money. The district got an extra $8,000 per year for each child marked as language deficient. Over 15 years, that added up to millions of dollars. I made copies of everything and sent them to our lawyer. 2 days later, Jamie Fisher called with a settlement offer. The district would create a new special education class specifically for kids affected by this situation. Giselle Ramos would teach it, and she had already promised to use every child's real name. The catch was the new class would be at a school 90 minutes away from our house. It meant 3 hours of driving every day just to keep my son's name. My husband and I stayed up all night talking about what to do. We went over the same points again and again. Haran needed stability, but he also needed his identity respected. The commute would be brutal, but staying meant more trauma. We looked at private schools, but none of them had openings for high-support autism programs. Moving wasn't an option with our jobs and mortgage. In the end, we decided to accept the transfer. It wasn't justice, but it was safety for Haran. I signed the paperwork the next morning with my hands shaking. The first day at the new school, I was so nervous I threw up in the parking lot. Haran held my hand tighter than usual as we walked to the classroom. Giselle was waiting at the door with a huge smile. She knelt down to Haran's level and asked him to type his name on his device. He slowly typed, "I am Haran," and looked at her face. She said, "Nice to meet you, Haran," very clearly, and waited. He actually made eye contact with her for a full second before looking away. It was the first time he'd looked at an adult besides family in months. She had his real name on everything in the classroom. His cubby, his desk, his daily schedule all said Haran in the same font he was used to. She'd even learned to pronounce it perfectly. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jackson went back to her original classroom like nothing had happened. The district sent out an email saying she would resume teaching with additional oversight, but nobody knew what that meant. The kids whose parents couldn't fight or didn't know how to navigate the system were stuck with her. I heard from other parents that she was still using the American names. She just wasn't putting them in writing anymore. The system had protected her and thrown away the most vulnerable kids. The OCR investigator called to say their review was ongoing, but it could take 2 years for findings. She said these cases moved slowly through the federal system. The ACLU lawyer was more honest and said systemic change would need multiple lawsuits over many years. Even if we won, it would be too late for the current students. They'd already been damaged. My boss wasn't happy when I asked to go part-time, but I didn't have a choice since the nearest school that would take Haran was 45 minutes away. The pay cut meant we couldn't make rent anymore, so my husband started working weekends at a warehouse while I drove Haran to Giselle Ramos's special ed class every morning. Giselle was everything Mrs. Jackson wasn't, and she actually knew how to teach kids with autism, but the damage was already done. Haran would freeze whenever anyone said anything that sounded like Harry, even if it was just someone saying they were in a hurry. His whole body would tense up and he'd start hitting his legs until I could calm him down, which sometimes took 20 minutes. The speech therapist said it might take years to undo what Mrs. Jackson did in just a few months, and even then we might never get back to where we were before. Meanwhile, the district sent out an email about their new cultural sensitivity training, which turned out to be a 2-hour online thing teachers could click through while doing other work. One teacher told me she finished it in 15 minutes by just clicking next without reading anything, and nobody checked if anyone actually learned anything. The principal sent a follow-up saying they were committed to diversity, but Mrs. Jackson was still teaching the same class with the same kids she was renaming. Maya Kwan called me when she won some journalism award for her coverage, and I thought maybe that would change something, but she sounded tired when she said the story got lots of clicks but nothing actually happened. The district got some bad press for a few weeks, then everyone moved on to the next scandal, while those kids were still being called the wrong names every single day. 6 months passed, and I was still driving 3 hours total every day while burning through our savings to pay for gas. Mrs. Jackson got a raise that year for what the district called her excellent handling of a difficult situation, which made me so mad I threw my phone when I read the email. The other kids whose names she changed were still in her class because their parents didn't have the option to drive that far or quit their jobs. The Korean dad finally gave up and moved his whole family to California, where his son could use his real name at the school. The Chinese mom pulled her daughter out to homeschool, but she had to quit her job as a nurse to do it. Our whole group that fought together just fell apart because we were all too broke and tired to keep fighting a system that protected her no matter what we did. That's why I'm writing this whole thing down now, because people need to know what really happened and how the system protects someone with tenure and connections while families like ours just get destroyed. Mrs. Jackson is still there right now, probably introducing some new kid as Mike instead of Mikhail, or Sam instead of Samir, while she collects teaching awards for her innovative methods. The district website has her picture up as Teacher of the Month, and the caption talks about her dedication to special needs students, which makes me want to scream every time I see it. Haran can type his name again most days, and when he does it right, he gets this huge smile that breaks my heart because he's so proud of knowing who he is. But sometimes when someone calls him, I see him pause and look confused, like he's waiting for someone to tell him that's not really his name. That little hesitation before he responds kills me, because I know exactly who put that doubt in his head. She took my confident kid who knew his name and turned him into someone who questions his own identity every single day. The worst part is she's doing it to other kids right now while I'm typing this, and there's nothing I can do to stop her. Their parents probably don't even know yet what's happening, because she's good at hiding it until the damage is already done. Some new family just moved here from India, and their son is in her class, and I want to warn them, but I don't even know how to find them. I check the class roster online sometimes, and I can see she's still changing names because there's a David who wasn't there before, but there's also a new kid from Bangladesh who just started. I bet David's real name is something she decided was too hard for the other kids who somehow managed to say Braxton just fine. Every time I think about those kids in her class right now getting their names erased, it makes me sick, but I'm out of money to keep fighting, and I can barely keep my own kids safe. The system won, and she won, and those kids lost. Just like Haran lost months of progress that we might never get back. That hesitation when he hears his name is something she put there, and it might never fully go away, no matter how much therapy we do, or how far I drive to keep him safe from her. Makes you wonder what those 3 board members were really thinking when they said their hands were tied. Feels like there's definitely some behind the scenes we're not seeing. Like the video, it helps more than you think.